Good evening, everybody. Hey, Aaron, how are you tonight, my friend?
I'm doing pretty well, Jeff. How are you doing?
I'm doing really good, man. Thank you. Welcome to School Sojourn, everyone. Andrea is not with us tonight. She is out and about doing what a paranormal celebrity does. She is speaking tonight, this weekend, rather, at the Ocean State Paracon in Rhode Island. She's going to be out at the farmhouse where the events that the movie The Conjuring is loosely based on happened. And so she's got a whole lot of stuff going on. So my dear friend, and now our dear friend, Aaron Tomlinson, is joining us tonight for this very special 2-hour broadcast of School Sojourn. So there will not be a break and then a world awakening tonight as usually takes place. We will just be going for a full 2 hours here on School Sojourn. So in the next hour, we'll probably have some people joining us who aren't joining us right now, because the two shows, while they share a lot of the same audience, they also have different audiences. So we'll probably have some different people joining us in that hour. But we are just here to have a conversation with you all, in front of you all, and just trust that Spirit does what Spirit does and blows on the sails of our interaction with one another, and somehow something relevant to your life and your reality comes forth. And I know that will happen because that always happens. And I was thinking tonight, I should say classes in session. I was thinking earlier today, Aaron, about the nature of conversation. And first of all, man, thank you so much for agreeing to be on. It's always pretty last minute when I get you the word. I kind of find out usually a lot of times sort of last minute, so I'm always putting it out there, and I know it's last minute, and you're always so gracious in agreeing to come on. But people have really come to love you and to love your voice and the wisdom that you share when you're on. And it's a joy for me to be able to introduce you to this world that I've been introduced to and welcomed into. And I know the let's say the sort of the vibe of this spiritual tribe is already up your alley anyways. And so we're so glad to have you tonight, man. And I don't know, anything you want to say? Just
thank you for having me, Jeff. I always consider it an honor and a privilege to be on with you and the people. And so I'm glad to be here, man. I'm ready for anything.
Yeah, same. So I was thinking today, Aaron, as I was driving around, and I was just thinking about the nature of conversation. And I was thinking about specifically how these times when we, whether it's you and me, or whether it's myself and Andrea, or whoever it is, whether it's on the show or not on the show, I'm always struck by how deep, powerful, intimate conversation. It's a divine encounter in itself. And
Sure.
I was thinking of the words of Martin Buber. I have them pulled up here because I love this quote, and it's something that I always think of when I begin the show. He says, "When two people relate to each other authentically and humanly, God is the electricity that surges between them."
Ooh, I love
And
that.
so when we converse with one another, there's something of eternity that we touch, and something of eternity that touches us. And I was just thinking about it, and I'm just going to share this real quick at the outset. And if you've got any thoughts on it when I'm done rambling, you just go ahead and share them, man. And we've got some other more specifics we'll get on to, and let you share anything that's really on your heart tonight as well. But this was just something that was really resonating in my heart today. I was just thinking of the nature of time, right? And we often hear people say that time is an illusion, and it is. And I want to say it was Plato who said that time is the moving image of eternity. In other words, eternity is what is. Eternity, nothing is proceeding into the future, nothing is receding into the past. Eternity is the middle of the wheel, and all the spokes go out from there. And eternity is what just simply is right there in the middle. There is no becoming, there is no past, there is simply a sacred and divine isness. And that's one way of conceptualizing eternity, and it's one that I tend to think in terms of. But I believe it was Plato who said that time is the moving image of eternity, meaning that time is sort of a gift that we are given as humanity, that eternity is streamed to us through, so we can experience that which just simply is, all as though it's happening. And so time is like a filter. So it's kind of like in Kabbalah, that God is essentially streamed through a series of filters into the human experience. And so time is something similar. It's streamed through this filter to us. And that's why we experience life as though it's happening, when in truth, life just simply is. I am is the ultimate nature of reality. It's what lies underneath the surface. It's not really becoming. It's not something that has a past. It's something that is. And again, that's just a concept. It's a way of thinking about it. But it's one that I find useful. But time is the filter that this streams to us through. So we experience it as though it's happening. And that's why we can see life in terms of cycles. And that's why things like the hero's journey motif of Joseph Campbell seems to apply almost universally, because we are experiencing a story that's being streamed to us, that is eternity. And I think about this, and I think about the Moses encounter with the burning bush, right? And so Moses encounters a bush in the desert that is apparently already dried up. So it's already in a state of entropy. It's in a state of entropy regardless of what state it's in, but it's dried up. It's in a desert climate, but it's also on fire. So this thing is in like stage 4 entropy. This thing is experiencing an increased and intensified state of entropy. And God manifests God's self within this burning bush to Moses. And when God manifests God's self through this bush, this thing that should be in an advanced state of entropy does not decay with the rapidity with which it should decay. It remains in a state of stasis, right? It's burning, but it's not consumed, like the Bible says, right? So, and I've always thought about that, because one of my thoughts about eternity is, if eternity is divine isness, it's divine perfection, just that is. It's not becoming, it doesn't have a past, it is. That if that manifests itself in the realm of time, if it subjects itself to the laws of time in order to manifest itself, it would have to appear as something that's in a rapid state of evolution and increase in order to really just be what it is, because it's divine perfection. So if it appears in time, it would have to appear as something that's in like fast forward evolution. And so if something that's in an advanced state of evolution meets something that's in an advanced state of entropy, there's this sort of stasis that's achieved. And so the bush burns, but it's not consumed, because it's caught between these two worlds in a sense in that moment. And then a voice speaks from the sacred flame that says, I am. And I know I'm imposing the English over the Hebrew there, but that's fine for my purposes tonight. I'll do that. Sure. That there's this that God speaks and identifies God's self to Moses in that moment as I amness. And there is something about those moments in which we just I am, when we're not rushing, when we're not in a hurry, when we are simply in love with what's happening because we love what's happening, when we're in a conversation, when we're speaking of things that speak to us mutually, and that divine electricity surges between us, and we just sink in and we enjoy it. In every conversation I've ever had with you, Aaron, is of that quality and is of that nature. And every conversation I've ever had with Andrea on this platform is the same thing. And there's something that happens in that moment of this just divine freezing of time, where it feels like it goes on forever, but it also feels like it flies by. But then it's over, and you feel like, geez, that went by like in a flash. But then when you think back to everything that was covered in that flash, it is so incredibly dense, you can hardly conceive of you can barely conceive how dense it is. And in the love chapter, the famous love chapter that Paul writes about, love is patient, love is kind, love is this, that, and the other. Paul says that there are ways in which the divine manifests itself through human beings, and he gives a couple of examples. Angelic glossolalia, which means the ability to speak in tongues that are not of human origin, in languages that are not of human origin, that are literally angelic languages. And there's examples of beliefs concerning this in other ancient Jewish writings. He speaks of prophetic prowess that allows one to understand, all wisdom and all knowledge. He speaks of a kind of love that allows oneself to give oneself even in martyrdom as a sort of gift, because they're so devoted to a cause. But he says all of these things, which seem so incredibly supernatural on the surface. He says, at the end of all things, when all things are done away with, they will be done away with, and they'll be shown to be, I don't want to say it's natural, because there's nothing bad about natural things, but he says they'll be shown to be more like epiphenomenon that emerge from within eternity rather than eternity itself.
Yeah.
And he says, however, three things will remain: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. So while other things might fade away, and they're outwardly supernatural, undeniably so, but if faith, hope, and love aren't at their core, they pass away just like the crumbling leaf passes away in fall and into winter. But anything done out of faith, hope, and love becomes eternal in quality, and therefore it lives forever. So it's like anything that's done in a spirit of faith, hope, and love, but especially love, it's like that filter through which eternity is streaming to us in the form of time. It's like that filter thins and more of eternity seeps through, and more of eternity sort of soaks the moment that we're in. And so something that seems as normal as a conversation literally becomes a theophany, a manifestation of the divine, where the eternal, I mean, there's lectures, there's sermons, there's other sorts of talks I've listened to that are quick, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, but eternity so soaks through the filter in those moments, because what is being done is a faith, hope, and love that it's so dense, it's unbelievable. And it isn't just because the person speaking is verbose and sharing a lot of deep ideas. It's that something is coming through them that's just unbelievable. And I don't know. I was just thinking about that today, in the nature of conversation and how the I amness of God, when we're just here, we're here with each other, we're here with the audience. We love what we're doing because we love what we're doing and what we're talking about. That there is this I amness that occurs, and as the voice speaks through the arboreal apparition of the burning bush, so that voice speaks through these moments of conversation and just says, I am. That this is, in this moment, a manifestation of God and of eternity. So just, I don't know, at the outset, I just declare that this next hour and some change, I declare that it will be one of those moments. And not because Aaron or I or anyone special, well, Aaron's special, I'm not going to take that on myself, but because we come here tonight humbly to just be with each other and bask in the wonder and awe that is the friggin' expansive universe we find ourselves ensconced in. And so, I don't know, I just wanted to open up with that little homily of sorts. And just, do you have any thoughts on that, Aaron, or anything along those lines?
I mean, there's a lot there, right? But what comes to my mind is the the privilege and the problem of being a human being. I would say the privilege and the problem, right? Because my personal belief is that we stand in both worlds, right?
Yeah.
That we stand in the eternal, or call it spiritual, or whatever you want to call it. We stand in that world. We exist in that world. We can have access to that world. We can have awareness of that. If we didn't stand in that world, you wouldn't be able to say what you just said.
Absolutely. Yep.
There'd be no awareness of it, right? And yet we're also, I love how you put that, Jeff, about how, time and space is the filtering of eternity to us. And yet so often we miss the privilege of the present moment because of the problem of the past or the future.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I've been a person, and I'll openly confess this, that, worry, I come from a long line of champion warriors in my family. And we have a joke in my family. It used to be, for the older crowd, it used to be the Rolodex of doom. You know what a Rolodex is, right?
I do. Yeah.
Put them on their desk, with phone numbers, and you'd roll through it to find a phone number. But we would talk about how we'd scan the environment or situations and think about worst case scenarios, right? Like what could happen in the future. And we would call that a Rolodex of doom. And it's funny because when I started working at the university, obviously I'm working with a much younger generation that doesn't know anything about Rolodex. And so I had to change my metaphor. So now I call it like the Google search of doom, right? Like internally doom scrolling. And it's a shame how many beautiful present moments of eternity that I missed because I was projecting my consciousness into a future that hadn't even happened yet. And more often than not, never does happen. So it's just this entire sort of veil or screen of imagination, right? So
Mm.
the privilege of being a human being is that we get to participate in this. The problem of being a human being is we forget who we are, which I think is the powerful message of the burning bush, right? Like,
Yeah.
I just had a birthday, so I'm appreciating everything you're saying.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about Moses, you know, where he's at, the stage of his life, the entropy in Moses's life, and how you talked about the entropy of the tree, and how that had to be a mirror in some sense
Yeah.
to Moses about his own life, because
Mm.
he
I
was
love
in
that.
entropy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so he sees this sign, this encounter, this theophany, as you talked about, but also it's mirroring back to him what's gone on in his own life. And
Mm.
one of the things that's interesting to me about, you know, Moses is the signs that God gives him at the bush. They didn't convince Pharaoh. You know, he goes into Pharaoh's court, and the first one was, you know, drop your staff and it'll become a serpent. And then I think, you know, put your hand in your coat, it'll become white. He never even performs that we have record
Mm-hmm.
of. He never
Yeah.
even performs that sign. And so I think the encounter with Moses there is God is connecting Moses to that privilege, right? He's connecting him to that higher self, or whatever we want to call it, that eternal aspect and nature of who we are.
Mm.
And it's interesting because, and I've never verified this, but you know, I trust the scholarship from the person who said this, that oftentimes in that time and place, that culture, they would record their personal history on their staff, on their rod, on their shepherd's rod.
Mm-hmm.
So in one sense, Moses is leaning on his past, and his past wasn't that great, right? He was raised in Pharaoh's court,
Mm-hmm.
and now he's, you know, been exiled, and he's in a desert, and he's tending sheep. And I've got to imagine that he had some unfinished business from his past, right? So that's the other side of it. There's the anxiety side, which is scrolling for doom, like I'm talking about, and you miss the beauty of the present moment. Or there's the regrets, the depression, the shame, the guilt over whatever it is, you know, from the past. And so the first sign that God shows him at the burning bush is take that staff that you're leaning on. So in a sense, take your history, right? Take your past, take your story, take your narrative about who you are, and lay it on the ground and look at it. And when he lays it on the ground, it becomes a serpent, and he draws back from it. And I can relate to that too, Jeff. I can relate to, you know, mistakes and stuff and whatever from my past, and look at my past and think, oh my God, you know, that thing's going to come back to bite me.
Yeah.
And yet he has to master it. He has to reach down and pick it back up. And then that becomes the instrument through which he performs all of the signs and wonders.
Yeah.
He performed, you know, when he parted the Red Sea, he stretched forth his staff. When he brought water from the rock, he struck the rock. Of course, we know how that went, but so
it still worked though.
It did. And so I just think about this, and I think that's who we are, right? Like we've got these narratives that run through our mind that are completely forged in time and space.
Mm-hmm.
And so we limit ourselves by understanding ourselves by who we were, or who we think we could become, or who we want to become, or whatever. You talked about that becoming, you know. And I think the key is to become, if we want to access eternity, we have to become grounded in that fiery present moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have to be grounded in that fiery present moment. And it's in that place then that we can get insight and wisdom about our future and about our situations and things like that. Like Jesus said, you know, don't worry about tomorrow. Today's evil is enough for you to deal with. If you deal with today's evil, tomorrow won't be a problem. It's what I take from that text. So that's kind of where my mind went as you were talking. And then the last thing I would say is I love conversation, and I think that's something that as a society I would like to see us get back to. Because conversation implies a sharing of ideas, a sacredness, right? Like I learn from you every single time I come on here. I'm enriched and empowered and edified, and yet so many times as a society, we're not really having conversation. We're having discussions where we have a point to prove, which again is holding on to a form in time and space, right? Like my opinion, my belief, my dogma, whatever the case may be. This is what's important right now. But that's just part of this time and space world, right? And we're playing ping pong in discussions, going back and forth, trying to beat the other person to bring them to our point of view. Whereas I think real conversation is letting go of all that noise of the past and the future and being present to the moment, being present to the other person and hearing what's being said and being enriched and empowered and changed by that exchange.
Yeah. No, man, absolutely. I love everything about what you just said. And there's so much to, there's so much to ping pong off of.
Yeah.
You know, firstly, the idea of just being present in the fire of the sacred present. You know, I'm reminded also of the raising of Lazarus in the Gospel of John, right? Where in the Gospel of John is absolutely, you know this, it's absolutely, I was going to say addled, but that's negative. It's absolutely laden with mystical imagery. The whole thing. John is a completely different sort of work. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptics, and then John is a completely different thing. Very mystical, very, very mystical and layered and metaphysical, even in how it's to be interpreted. But at the raising of Lazarus, right? So his sisters are present at the tomb. Jesus waits something like 4 days before going. After he hears his dear friend Lazarus is sick, he waits like 4 days. Jesus is always pulling those kind of moves in the gospel. It's kind of something I like to talk about whenever I preach somewhere. Like pull out the I'll just call them the jerk moves of Jesus in the name of not being crass. But you know, he pulls a lot of those, like the men on the road to Emmaus. He leads them on all day, right till he gets them to the brink of realizing it's him. And once they realize it's him, he vanishes before their eyes, and you know, all that kind of stuff. It's like, dude, just knock it off, would you? But there's always a point, because we're not just reading the writings of a documentarian who is walking around and writing everything down. We're reading accounts. We're reading commentary on accounts that are meant to convey deep spiritual truths, not necessarily literal fact or history, even though it may be rooted in those things. That's not the point. Anyway, so at the raising of Lazarus, oh God, it's been a while since I preached on this, so I don't remember which sister says what, but they say, if you had been here in the past, our brother would be alive. If the past had been different, he'd be alive. It says, but it's okay, because I know at the resurrection, at the last day, in the future, he'll be made whole and be made well and be raised up. And then Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life, in the here and in the now. And then he calls Lazarus forth, of course, and Lazarus comes forth. But there's that idea of if it had been different then, maybe it will be different in the future. So then, and then. But the divine always brings those things together and says, no, but I am the resurrection and the life now. This is all that there actually is. Even that thing you're putting your hope in, that's then, it's going to be now, when then is something that you're interfacing with. So you may as well be in the now, and that's where resurrection occurs. The other thing that really stuck out to me, that what you brought up about what I said, what I opened with, was I loved it, that Moses was, in essence, projecting the contents of his own unconscious mind onto the experience of his encounter with God in the burning bush. And so this is something I always tell people, because, hey, you know, a lot of the people who are watching the show are people who have had paranormal experiences of one kind or another. And I really mean of one kind or another, whether it's having grown up in a haunted house, or, you know, quote unquote haunted, whatever terminology one is comfortable using, whether they're living in one at the present, or whether they just had an experience as a child playing with a Ouija board and something, you know, I mean, because I had experiences like that as a kid, that when I was an atheist, I was like, okay, I know for an absolute fact that the questions being asked of this entity by my friends, the answers weren't known by them. And I know what the idiometer effect is. I know unconscious muscle movements can make people's hands move certain ways, and the planchette moves just so because the board is made of a certain material. The material on the bottom is such that it moves. That I understand that, but my hand wasn't on the board, and it was telling them things like addresses and my grandpa's name and birthday. They don't know that. They're like 13-year-old kids. You think they know my grandpa's birthday? So like there's just things like that in our past, moments where we peek behind the veil and we see something, whether you have an encounter with some kind of, a UFO or even some kind of cryptid or something like that. This field is really broad.
Right.
And the thing about this community, it's that like the UFO people, the ghost people, and the cryptid people tend to like not really get along all that well. But then there's a lot of people who are like, hey man, all of this stuff is really just one thing manifesting itself in a variety of different ways. And I'm open to that idea. But what I'm open to more than anything is the fact that encounters that we have when we encounter a burning bush, be it in the form of things that go bump in the night, be it in the form of things that go bump in the forest or things that go flash in the sky, these burning bushes we experience allow us a moment to externalize our internal world.
Yeah.
They allow us, they become a projector screen onto which we can project the contents of our own unconscious and perhaps the larger collective unconscious even. And in a moment of encounter like that, we can learn things about ourselves that it would have taken us decades to learn otherwise. And I know that's true of me. I've told the story about how post deconstruction, post leaving my post as a pastor, not knowing what life was going to look like in the future, things spinning out of control, literally feeling like things were just exploding and flying all over the place. I'm on my back porch, may or may not have been smoking a cigar and just enjoying the summer night. I don't know.
Yeah.
Pastors don't do those things, but ex-pastors can. And I'm just out there enjoying the summer evening, and I swear that I see this orange orb. I won't say I've never seen anything like this. I saw something like this as a child, and it's why it was so significant to me. Because as a child, on my way to church one night, my mom and a friend of mine watched as these two orange orbs for the entirety of like the 10-mile trip from our house to the church just slowly moved closer and closer together until they just became one thing. And then we just were like, what in the world did we just see? And, I never knew what that was, but that moment was in my mind. It was just like, I'll never forget it. And I'm sitting out on my back porch that night, and I see a single orange orb, like the one that I saw those two orbs become, hovering there. And then it splits into like a dozen, and they just whiz all over the place like fireflies. And, now looking back on it, I'm like, maybe it could have been a drone. I have no clue what this thing was, but I saw it. And then I saw it like a couple of nights later, the exact same thing near my home, but in a different area. I mean, I literally drove down the street trying to like chase this thing down and get out of my car and get video of it. Like it was so profound. I don't know what it was. Like I said, could have been fireworks, could have been a drone, could have been, some, who knows, all I know is in that moment, what was happening in here was projected onto it. And I saw my life that had slowly, what I saw as a child, those two things coming together, these two things that I'd been trying to like force to be one. In that moment, I saw them blow into, a million pieces. And that's exactly what I felt like. And I projected the contents of my unconscious onto that experience, and it beamed back to me. It left me as a projection. It returned to me as a projectile, and it taught me something about myself that it would have taken me decades to understand, but I saw it in that moment. And that's like the principle, what is it, Psalm 84:10, better is one day in your courts than 1,000 days elsewhere. That one moment in the presence of something sacred like that can do in you what it would take thousands of years elsewhere to have done. And I love how you brought that out about Moses. He's seeing the entropy of this bush that's on fire, and he's projecting that maybe chaos and maybe that sense of degradation that he's feeling inside of him onto this, and then it comes back to him as I am. And that was very beautifully said, man. I love that. I don't know why I had never thought of that, but that's what I love about this field,
right?
Is that all of these things, I don't have to know what they are.
Right.
I don't have to know the truth or untruth of what a ghost is or what. if what you see in the sky, it's alien technology. I don't know. I don't know. I don't have the answers for that. I'm not the guy who has the answers. All I know is I've had experiences with things, and I could sit around all day trying to figure out the particulars of what it is, but that's not really my passion. That is other people's passion, and thank God they're there, because I enjoy listening to them. But for me, it's about learning. It's about externalizing the inner person and having that inner person reflected back to me off of the silver screen of whatever this thing is, and seeing myself. Because what is it, Jung, who said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you'll call it fate. And I was just talking to someone the other night about a dream they had, and I was like, typically the figures you encounter in dreams are extensions of yourself. And well, I mean, obviously it's all happening in your mind, and that doesn't mean it's not something larger than that, but these are aspects of yourself that are trying to reflect back to you things about yourself. And they're like, well, and the question may be like, well, this thing in this dream seems so other than me. And it's like, well, that's because your own mind knows that in order for you to learn something about yourself, it has to encounter it as the other, right? If it only sees it as yourself, it won't recognize it. So you have to see it in the mirror. And that's what these kind of experiences are. These moments of divine encounter, whatever they are, they beam back to us the truth about ourselves. That's a good point, Aaron. That's good stuff, man.
I love how you said that, because you mentioned Kabbalah earlier. And so the idea, from Kabbalah is that whatever God is or was existed as a singularity that could not know itself, right?
Yeah.
And if we think about ourselves in the same way, unless we have something out there to reflect back to us, we can't really know ourselves, because it takes two to know one. In other words, knowledge is completely impossible without there being a knower and the knowledge that's being obtained. So there's automatically separation there, right?
Yeah.
And so I love that. Now, where I'm at right now, Jeff, and this may change in a year, but where I'm at right now in trying to understand this stuff, and I like how you brought this out, because I do know enough about this community to know that, there's a lot of conflict and diversity, and different groups that have had different experiences don't necessarily want to hang out together or whatever, right? But and I got this from Whitley Strieber. I read a book that really impacted me. It was written by Whitley Strieber, the author of the Communion books, and many others. And he wrote a book called The Supernatural with Jeffrey Kripal, who is the head of the humanities department at Rice University. And they get into this idea in the book that we are participating in these experiences with our projections. That these things occur on some level, at least, in what they call the imaginal realm. Now, they're very quick to clarify that doesn't mean that something physical is not happening out there.
Right.
It's just that there's this interplay. We have a tendency in our culture and in the way we think, the way our language is set up, to do these either or kind of categories in our mind. It's either this or that. It's a really black and white way of thinking. It has to be this. It can't be that. These are contrasts. If this is true, this can't be true. Synthesis. No, not synthesis. Thesis and antithesis.
Yes.
Thinking, right? And we get stuck there rather than going to the synthesis where I was trying to get, which is it could be in both, right? And so you mentioned the Gospel of John. I think the Gospel of John is profound. I think it's one of the most amazing works of literature ever written. And I still have a love for that gospel. And, it begins in the beginning was the logos, where in the beginning was the word, but the Greek word is logos, which I know, but it's where we get all the ologies, right? Psychology, theology, biology, all that stuff. So it has to do with this aspect of consciousness. And so if we begin with consciousness, if we begin with, rather than the scientific materialist who says everything that exists can be measured and observed out there geometrically and is matter or energy, right? And then our consciousness is the byproduct of this sort of evolutionary accident that caused our brains to form a certain way. And then because of this arrangement of matter and electricity and chemicals in our brain, we experience what we experience. And so we begin with matter and say consciousness is the byproduct of matter. But if we flip that on its head and we say consciousness, mind, logos is the fundamental aspect of reality.
Yeah.
And if we take our lead from John's gospel, which was influenced by Greek philosophies of the time, that everything that was made has been made out of this logos, including us. And one of I think the most tragic mistranslations in all of the Bible, in my opinion, in my very humble opinion, because I'm not a Bible scholar and I don't read the Greek, but in John 1:14, where it says the word became flesh and dwelt among us, the word there, I ran it through a search one time. That Greek word is really never translated as among anywhere else in the scripture. It's within. So they could have easily translated it. The word became flesh and dwelt within us, and we beheld his glory, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then Jesus becomes that external model that you're talking about in the story, because I'm going to geek out a little bit with my Bible stuff here, but when after Jesus is baptized, two disciples come to him and he says, "What do you seek?" And they said, "We want to know where you abide. We want to know where you live." And he says, "Come and see." And I think what's happening there is that whoever wrote the book of John is inviting the reader to come and see where this word abiding within us, how it dwells, because the culmination of the book in John 14, 15, and 16, and even 17 is, "In my Father's house, there are many mansions.
Yeah.
And I go to prepare a place for you," right? And the Father dwells in me. So it's talking about this incredible existential metaphysical reality of being the habitation of spirit, right? So I'm digressing a little bit, but I think what we're seeing in the Gospel of John is a pattern, not an external historical story. Jesus belabors the point in the early part of the gospel. Don't take this literally, you know?
Yeah.
He goes to Nicodemus and says, "Unless you're born from above, you can't enter the kingdom." And Nicodemus says, "Well, do I have to enter my mother's womb again?" And Jesus kind of rebukes him for taking it literally. He goes to the woman at the well and she says, "Where's this well that I can drink from where I'll never thirst again?" And he kind of, it's like it's inviting the reader in the story and saying, if you take this literally and historically, you're missing the whole point, because it's pointing to this spiritual reality, right? So if consciousness, all that to say, if consciousness is base reality, if it's foundational, and everything that we see out there and everything that exists is an extension of the logos, including us in whom the logos dwells, then it is an and both. It's not an either or, right?
Yeah.
So, and I'll finish with this, Jeff, but Alfred Korzybski wrote a book called Science and Sanity in the 1930s. It was just a masterpiece, I think, on linguistics and really ahead of his time in certain neuroscience explanations of things. And he has a famous quote from that book that says, "The map is not the territory."
Yeah.
And I think the map is where we get confused, right? It's where we get confused in time and space and with form. And so we'll have a certain experience and we'll say, okay, this is the territory, right? This UFO encounter that I had, this is the territory, or this Ouija board encounter that I had, or this, haunted house encounter. And we're coming up with explanations, but the explanations is just the map. So I think that all of it can be true because all of it is aspects of our own consciousness. And we are always projecting our consciousness onto the territory. We are always, that's why Alfred Korzybski had to say, the map is not the territory. You have to distinguish between what is your projection and what is actually out there. Much like Carl Jung saying, if you don't make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you'll call it fate.
Yeah. Yeah. No, man, I agree with you 100%. And I think that the individual unconscious, my individual my conscious mind, my subconscious mind, and then even the unconscious. So conscious being that which I'm conscious of, and I know you know this, but subconscious being more like the basement, it's down there. You might not go down there a lot, but it's there. The unconscious it's sub, you know it's there even if you don't go there a lot. I have a crawl space under my house. I rarely go in. I go to check the some of the plumbing stuff now and again, and I get the Christmas decorations out now and again, but I don't hang out in the crawl space. But I know it's there, and I know what goes on down there is integral to the running of my house.
Right.
And then there's the unconscious, which I'm literally unconscious really of what goes on there. It's beyond me. It's larger than me. And that is sort of the ocean that we're planted in. We're all islands planted in the sea of this massive mind. Call it God, call it whatever you will. But on each of our islands is a lagoon. And so what happens here that's why we're all connected, because what bubbles up in your center can bubble up in my center. And that's why we're all connected by this larger mind. And, the morphic field, if you want to use Rupert Sheldrake's terminology or whatever, but it's something like that. And I'm with you in that I think and I might be getting off from even what you were saying, but I don't think so totally. So to say you project the contents of your own unconscious, it isn't just to say that it's just you're interacting with. You are also interacting with whatever that larger.
It's in both.
Yeah. It isn't just your imagination. It's like at the end of Harry Potter, Dumbledore tells Harry, like, of course this is happening in your imagination, Harry. That doesn't mean it's not real. My imagination is like the facilitator. It's the receiver of consciousness that is beyond me. And I truly do believe consciousness is beamed in. I mean, look at the Sphirot. I mean, I really do believe that model is something approximating truth, and that's how, call it what you will, the Christ, whatever, beams its way into each of us as individuals and then beams itself out of us creatively. And I don't know, this just came to me as you were talking about John and bad interpretations of John, and also the culmination of the Gospel of John. I think one of the worst, it might not be one of the worst translations, but it's at the very least, I think one of the worst applications in the Gospel of John is John 14:6. Where Jesus is quoted as saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. And how that was interpreted for me growing up in the evangelical Christian world, God bless it, is that Jesus was saying, I am the only way to heaven. And what we meant when we said that was that Jesus, the particular manner in which Jesus was being presented to us by our leaders, was the only way to heaven. It wasn't even the historical figure of Jesus the Christ. It was this particular 20th century interpretation of Jesus, and believing that this was truth was really the only way to heaven. But Jesus didn't say anything about heaven really in that passage of scripture. He says no one really comes to or experiences the Father, their true source, this larger consciousness, whatever you want to call it, unless they come through the principle that I embody and represent. And the principle that I think Jesus embodies and represents is that principle of the Christ, which is what? That flesh and spirit dwell together in this being, and there is no friction. There is no division. There is no opposite ends of the magnets repelling one another. It's the other way. They go together, they collide, they coalesce, they are one. Jesus, the church fathers, I know you understand this, but there is the hypostatic union that Jesus is not, he was not understood by Orthodox Christians, whatever that means, as being 50% God and 50% man, or 70% and 30%, or 20 and 80. It was understood that the only proper way to speak of this thing, which it took them 300-400 years to even begin to wrap language around, what a few individuals experienced, thousands of miles away from them at the time, wrote about. And so they spoke of it as he has to be fully God and fully man. And these things dwell together harmoniously in one entity, right? And so I think the principle that Jesus represents is the principle that things we don't think belong together actually belong together. That there can be, that there is, it's not just thesis and antithesis, but it's synthesis between flesh and spirit, matter and spirit, whatever we want to say. And so that's the principle. And Jesus says, if you want to really understand the truth about your source and the larger reality that binds all things together, that's the principle you have to understand. And when you understand, when you see the key at the bottom of the map, all of a sudden the features on the map begin to present themselves and make sense. But until you see the key, it's just going to look like blobs and weird colors, and you're not going to understand that that's water and that's elevation and that's below sea level, and that you're not going to know that because you've never seen the key. And I think what Jesus is saying is that I'm a key in that sense. If you understand the principle on display here, you can understand the principle that's at work in the larger world, which is that, and this is my opinion, I think that the whole of one of the points to existence is realizing that parts of our nature we don't think go together. You know what I mean? And life is just an unfolding and just a journey of discovering that truth and that reality, reconciling past with your present, reconciling things that seemed unjust and were in some ways, but still they happen. So what are you going to do about it? You know, I think all of life is something like that, coming to terms with that. And it's these things coming together. And I don't know, we've talked about Jesus in the church like he's a limitation set on the manifestation of God, but I think Jesus really is more of a liberation of the work of God. And even understanding the Kabbalistic tree of life, which I know the audience understands, it's like you have Hesed, right, which is like flow in a dangerous way almost, because it's just the doors are open and everything just, it's the shining elevator and everything's just gushing out at you, right? It's just uncontrollable flow. But then Hesed passes through, you may have to help me. Gevura, right? So Gevura is limitation in a way, but it's not limitation that actually limits, it's limitation that liberates. So an illustration I heard a rabbi use and I found very helpful is that Gevura is something like limiting the oscillation of the strings on a guitar, where if you just strum the open guitar, you get E, A, D, G, B, E, and it's not necessary. You can't write a song using that. But if you limit the oscillation by playing a chord, you limit, yes, but you also liberate the strings to do what they're there to do. And then Gevura passes through Tiferet, correct? Which Tiferet is then, now that you've limited the oscillation of the guitar and you're making music, Tiferet is like beauty of knowing how to aim that and how to interpret it. So if I'm playing the guitar at an old folks home, unless it's like the old folks of like 40 years from now, I'm not going to play death metal.
Right.
In 40 years, I might be. That might be what they want to hear. But if now I'm going to play something very different than I would play if I was at like a death metal show. But if I'm at a death metal show, I'm not going to play Mare Zedotes and Dozy Dotes and Little Lambs Ivy there either, unless I'm doing it ironically. So when Jesus says he's the way, the truth, and the life, and it sounds like limitation, I think it's more like that. It's limitation that's liberation in a way. He's saying, I'm a principle. If you apply this principle to the Hesed of divine reality, there's limitations put on it, but it's more like playing a chord and knowing your audience and things flow more correctly. Anyways, Aaron, I'm hopped up on ideas tonight, man. So maybe you can apply some Gevura to my wild thoughts.
No, I love it. I love how you brought the tree of life in with that as well. But that's an interesting thing, right? John 14:6. And even the hypostatic union, right? And I love how you said that life is about learning to reconcile all these various different aspects of our lives and parts of ourselves. And, one of the things that happened as I was deconstructing, going through this process, you mentioned 1 Corinthians 13 at the beginning of tonight, and there's also 2 Corinthians. And 2 Corinthians 13 has a kind of an obscure verse in there where Paul says, test yourself. And really the word there in the Greek, as far as I understand it, means examine yourself to see if you're in the faith. Yep. Then he makes this statement. He says, do you not know that Jesus Christ is in you? And that combined with Colossians, the Colossians text about Christ in you, the hope of glory. But just prior to that, Paul says, this is the fullness of the mystery that I'm preaching. And I find it interesting that Paul never fixates on the historical Jesus. He never fixates on his teachings. He seems to be, if you read closely the biblical narrative, he seems to be at odds with James and Peter and John, and they seem to be at odds with him. But that phrase, Jesus Christ is in you, and then looking at John's gospel, as I mentioned earlier, that John 1:14 could have been interpreted, the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. In other words, if that's the foundation of the Gospel of John, that the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and the word was God, the word was divine, and the word became flesh, then we're supposed to also experience and understand that hypostatic union, where we realize ourselves as fully divine and fully human, and merge and bring those things together. So then if we can see the story of Jesus, not from a historical perspective and arguing about all the historicity of it, but if we can see it as what if Paul and John and certainly the Gnostics were saying this story, in much the way Joseph Campbell speaks about myth, that myth is to speak to our spiritual potentials, that it speaks truth on a higher level, because I can know historically the story of Adam and Eve, and I can believe that or not believe that that's historicity, right? But who cares? But if I can read it mythologically in a way that it speaks to my own reality, it speaks about my own shame, it speaks about my own hiddenness, it speaks about my own separation, it speaks about my own blame shifting, right?
Yeah.
So if we can look at the principle of Jesus, like you said, this principle of divinity and humanity in harmony together, then perhaps the gospel stories are there to point us to that inner reality.
Yes.
That is us, that hypostatic union that is us. And perhaps the Orthodox Church, for lots of socio-political reasons, made the message of Christ the exception rather than the example.
Yeah.
Rather than being the ideal, and the ideal being the blending of the two together, not trying to get out. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, you talked about, I was almost cracked up because you talked about smoking a cigar, on a summer evening on your porch, and, being an ex-pastor, you can do that. And I thought, and I did the same thing, still do at times. And we tried to destroy our humanity.
Yeah.
And if you want to use the Sephiroth and the tree of life and Kabbalah as an example, Malkut, which is the material reality at the bottom, it's the bride, it's the receptor of everything. It's the terminus. It's the end goal of the lightning flash, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the quest that I've been on for the last 6 or 7 years is exactly what you said, Jeff. How do I take these various aspects of my humanity that the church told me were wrong and evil, or that I don't like because of injustice or because of just things about myself that I don't like. I lose my temper. I'm not this perfect angel of a person that I want to be. And instead of trying to kill that off, instead of trying to escape from that, maybe the real gospel message, if you want to call it that, is this learning how to blend all of these energies together in harmony, so that we're not rejecting our humanity and we're not using our spirituality as a way to bypass being a human being, as a way to bypass the things that we're dealing with in time and space, but rather as a way to transcend and empower and beautify our human experience. And I just really like that idea, man.
Yeah. Well, and you know what? We've gotten onto the Gospel of John tonight for some reason. That was not intentional. That was not part of the discussion. But it's kind of become a theme. And the opening lines of John's Gospel, the prologue to John's Gospel, in the beginning was the Word, or the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God, right?
Right.
Now, that right there sets the stage for what the Gospel is about. And the word Logos, obviously, predates Christianity. It comes to us from the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus.
Right.
And if you look at the Heraclitean idea of what Logos was, Logos represents a sort of friction between opposing forces. And it's very chaotic. When you read about it, he talks about friction between gods and men. He talks about friction between divine forces, but it's sort of the principle that the world is comprised. If you strip everything away, at the heart of reality, there's opposing forces, and reality is made up of what happens when those forces overcome one another. And that's what reality is. It's things in opposition to one another that become one through their consuming of one another via this opposition. And that's kind of the Heraclitean logos. When you get to John, John speaks of logos or logos in a completely different way. He says, in the beginning was the logos, and the logos was with God, and the logos was God. So you've got two things, God and the logos. They're face to face, though. The word with there denotes face to faceness and intimacy, as opposed to friction. And they unite not through violence, they unite through relating to one another. And so I think the mystery there is that it's not that one opposing force has to overcome another opposing force. Right. It's that they don't truly oppose one another. They dance with one another. They embrace, and in that embrace, they become one rather than becoming one because, well, I eat you. And so technically, you're now one with me because I've ingested you. Yep. It's more like the mystery of marriage or something like that, as Paul will speak about it later, of oneness through a coming together in that kind of a union. And that sets the stage for everything else that goes on in John's gospel. And I think that is what it's all about. It's all about these seemingly opposing forces coming together. And another Jung quote that I always think of when I talk about this subject is that in all chaos, there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order. And what seems like the chaotic bumping together of things that don't go together is actually wholeness trying to happen. It's actually God, whatever word you want to use to describe that phenomenon, trying to happen. That's how it happens in our lives. And I cried out in a kind of desperation, a couple of years back now, because I didn't know what to do with myself anymore. I was a pastor for 12 years. I stepped away for about 7 or 8. At the time, it was less than that. And I was still traveling. I was writing books. I was still doing stuff that was ministry related. But, I didn't really know where I fit anymore. And, I'm working like a secular job to pay the bills while still doing my stuff on the weekends. And that's all fine and good. Nothing wrong with that. And, it's admirable, I think, to those of us who have to do that. But I just felt in some ways like, God, where do I fit anymore? Where do I even fit in the church thing? I still have churches inviting me to speak and I'm still going there, but in some ways I feel a little out of place. I don't, when we go out to eat afterwards, it's not like it just feels different, Yeah. I really cried out in desperation just because I was like, where do I fit in any of this anymore? What am I? Because I'm a pastor. I'm a preacher. It was very easy to say. And I just said, what am I? And the response came either from without or within or from both. You are a gatherer of fragments. And from that moment on, that's what I've sought to make everything I do about. Whether it's internally, gathering the fragments together of my own being, the things that don't seem to fit, and finding out how they do, and then helping other people to do the same thing. And I was taken to the stories it's in Matthew and it's in Mark, the story of the feeding of the 5,000 and the story of the feeding of the 4,000. These two stories happen parallel to one another. We often only talk about the feeding of the 5,000, or we talk about one of them and we talk about them like they're one event, but they're two events that occur parallel to one another in the gospel story very purposely. And in the first event, it's a crowd of all Jews that it's an entirely Jewish audience that Jesus performs this miracle for. They're in the middle of the wilderness. Jesus is teaching, and the disciples are like, we are in a barren place and there's nothing to eat. And Jesus says, give them something to eat. And there's a young boy there who has some raw material to work with, a small lunch. And Jesus breaks it and he gives thanks for it. And I think the great lesson there is every time you think you're in a barren place, look at what lay before you and think and give thanks for it instead of cursing it. And it will show itself to be more than what you perceive it to be in that moment. Anyways, then he begins to distribute it and everybody eats. And there's 5,000, not counting the women and the children. We won't get into why they're not counted, but
right.
I'm not going to impose 21st century values on a 2,000-year-old text.
Right.
So there's thousands of people there. They all eat from this small lunch, and then the fragments are gathered. They gather together the broken pieces, and they bring them back to Jesus, and it's 12 baskets full. The spiritual symbolism there being this is a Jewish audience. So the 12 tribes of Israel are represented by the 12 fragments left over, and the 12 tribes had been scattered. And so Jesus sows into this crowd of Jewish individuals, and what he sows comes back to him, but it comes back to him looking like those to whom it was sowed. It leaves looking like one thing, but it returns as gathered fragments bearing the image of those to whom it was sown. Anyways, and in between, like, then Jesus goes to a Gentile region, Tyre and Sidon. I know you know this story. And that's a Gentile region. And a woman meets him whose daughter is demon possessed, according to the story, and she begs him to have mercy on her daughter.
One of those jerk Jesus moments, right? That you were talking about.
This is one of those. This is one of those moments, man. And I've heard so many preachers try to get Jesus off the hook on this one.
Yeah.
And even then, it's like, even trying to get him off the hook, like the apologetics types, it's like, you're still missing the point. You don't need to do that. There's a larger point than proving Jesus wasn't being a jerk. Yeah, he was being a jerk in the story, but there's a point that's being proven. So, but Mark, the source material, calls her a woman of Syrophoenician origin, but Matthew calls her a Canaanite. Now, that would have been an anachronism to call her a Canaanite at that time. Canaanites were the ancient enemies of Israel, according to the Pentateuch, that they were told by God to completely wipe out and to show no mercy to. And here comes a Canaanite. Matthew redubs her a Canaanite because he's trying to prove a point. She comes to Jesus and asks him as the son of David, which is not the way a Gentile would have spoken to, that's Jewish language, and asks for mercy, something a Jew was not supposed to show a Canaanite. And he blows her off and he kind of insults her. He does. He calls her a dog in one sense. And she says, yeah, but even the dogs will eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. What Jesus said to her is, it's not right to take the children's bread and cast it to the dogs. I've only been sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. What did he just do? He multiplied bread for those to whom he claims to have been sent, the house of Israel. And now here's a Canaanite representing Israel's ancient enemies asking for mercy. Jesus says, I can't take their bread and give it to the dogs. I mean, again, very jerk move. And then she says, even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. And then he looks at her and he's like, woman, your faith is incredible. Let it be done. And her daughter is healed. He then goes to, and he heals and performs exorcisms on another number of Gentiles. And it says they praise the God of Israel because, again, they're not Israelites. They're Gentiles. That's why it says that specifically. Then Jesus finds himself amongst another crowd, just like he did the other crowd. And they're hungry again. And they say they're in a barren place and there's nothing to eat. And there happens to be another boy there with a small lunch. Jesus takes that lunch. He gives thanks for it. It's multiplied. Everyone feasts and everyone eats. And then they gather the fragments from that lunch and they bring it back to Jesus. And this time it's 7 baskets full. And the 7 baskets, if you go, I believe it's Deuteronomy 32, represents the 7 Canaanite nations that Israel was told to wipe out when they went into the promised land.
Wow.
Which is why Matthew renames the woman a Canaanite as opposed to just a Gentile woman from a certain region. So in this instance, Jesus is saying, look, this bread does not just belong to the quote unquote children of Israel. He gives the children's bread to those thought to be their enemies, proving that everyone is a child of God in the context of this religious perspective. But the beautiful thing about it, and that was a long way of making my point, but the point in both stories that I want to make is that Jesus sows who he is in the form of this bread that goes out to a crowd. And then the fragments are gathered. The fragments are gathered, represent the manner in which the people received it is gathered together, and it returns to Jesus looking like those to whom it was sown. So in the case of the Jews, it returns in 12 baskets, 12 tribes. In the case of the symbolic Canaanites, it returns in 7 baskets, representing the Canaanite nation. So the very gospel message returns to Jesus looking like those that were once considered God's enemies, right? And so it's like, as followers of Jesus back in the day, we were all about, we've got the message, we've got it right. look like us, talk like us. It's not just that we're right about this, it's that we're right about everything else because we're right about this. Now, by default, we're right about everything else. When the truth of the matter is, I think the whole thing was supposed to be about this divine exchange where everyone we interacted with, whatever we sowed, returned to us looking like those to whom we sowed it. And then there was just this constant gaining of complexity and layers being added, and the message transforming and evolving until it becomes what? The gathering together of all of these fragments that maybe actually represents what this larger consciousness is, this, monad, if you will, or whatever, that's sort of this singularity that's experienced this big bang, and all this matter has been cast out here. We gather it all together and we see the reality again. And then when we finally gather it together and see it, it blows up on us again. And then we're set back on the quest of gathering it together so we can see it. And then once we think we got it, it blows up again, And to me, that's just kind of what life is about. Sorry, man. I'm hopped up on ideas tonight, Aaron. So you talk, man.
No, I'm curious, Jeff, because you said that you were, and I could so relate to what you were saying. Like, I don't fit here. And I always felt that way, by the way.
Yeah.
I always hated going to pastors' gatherings, going to lunch after. It's just something that I did, but I always felt like a square peg in a round hole or whatever. So I could so relate to what you were saying. But you said that, you were crying out in desperation. What am I? And the answer you heard back was to be a gatherer of fragments, and profound revelation there, profound revelation about the gathering of the fragments of the baskets and what you sow it coming back looking like what you sowed into. But how did that speak to you personally? If you don't mind getting into that, I'm just curious, like how have you taken that and made sense now out of who you are from that experience? I'm curious about it.
Okay. Well, it's really interesting how this conversation's coming around, because I didn't really plan for it to go the way it's gone, but it's all, again, in all chaos, there's a cosmos, and all disorder, a secret order. It always has a way of coming together. So for me, it even goes back to what I said about seeing that image as a child of these two things in the sky coming together and trying to force these things into oneness. And then when I have my breakdown, I see what to me represents that oneness I was trying to achieve split, right? And then again, all these years trying to find that wholeness and oneness again. So it had a lot of things. At the time, I had really kind of lost my faith entirely. And I was kind of, for all suits and purposes, an atheist. I was like, it depended on the day how Richard Dawkins-ish of an atheist I was. You know what I'm saying? But other days I was like the Jesus kind of atheist, where I'm like, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is like, I'm praying, but
I get both analogies.
But I'm praying about how you don't exist, so go figure. Anyways, but I had kind of lost anything resembling faith at the time. And interestingly enough, oddly enough, it was at the invitation of a friend. I go over to their house one night. Things were kind of rough in my life at the time. And so I went over to this friend's house, and they made me dinner, and we watched The Conjuring. We watched the movie The Conjuring, which is why all of this is so interesting to me. And in watching that movie, and I hadn't really watched a horror movie in a long time, because I come from a real strict background. And even at the time, I was very much more grace-based and inclusion and universalist at the time. So those things didn't bother me at all anymore, but it hadn't been anything I'd gotten into. It just was never really an interest. It was when I was younger, but it wasn't ever anything I really had ever gotten back into. And they were like, this movie is different. There's something about it. So I watched it. And I have to say that it evoked in me feelings and memories from my childhood of growing up in a home that, for lack of a better term, was haunted. And at the moment, I do lack better terms to describe the things that happened there. And it brought me back to that. And so again, it was like a burning bush I was projecting myself onto. I was seeing myself in this, and it began to reactivate in me this sense of like, okay, there's more to reality than what I've experienced. And I come from a charismatic background like you. I've prophesied. I've laid hands on people and watched them fly across the room. I've laid hands on people and them claim to be healed. I've seen clouds of smoke manifest in the middle of buildings. I remember praying for a kid once and literally watching smoke come out of his mouth and fill the room. I mean, I've been in the presence of some wild stuff. Like,
Yeah.
so it wasn't like I grew up, no offense to my Baptist brothers and sisters, but like a strict Baptist where all of this stuff was off limits and taboo. I'd seen this stuff, but like I went through some deep pain and turmoil, and it was easier to kind of not believe it. And so that wasn't at all what my conscious motivation was, but I now kind of see that it was.
Right.
So, but that was a fragment from my past that I'd let go of. That whole experience, it was a fragment. I had cut myself off from it. But in that moment, I brought it back. I gathered that to myself, and I began to look at it and examine it and be like, all right, what's this all about? Lo and behold, 8 some years later, I now do a show every week with the eldest daughter of the family.
That's so crazy.
That story's based on, and you're on this show with me tonight. And it was like, and we met completely serendipitously. It doesn't make any sense. On paper, there should be no connection, right? It doesn't make sense at all, but it happened. So like it's the gathering of the fragments, and it manifested itself, and now it returned to me in a different form, and now even my Christianity looks different because of it. I don't know. Anyways, but even then, the next part was reconciling with my fundamentalist past and my Christian past, because the urge is to run from that as fast as I can because of the harm that I saw caused by others, the harm that I know I caused in my sincerity. The temptation is to run, but there's no running. It exists. It will haunt you until the day you die, unless you look at it and examine it and forgive yourself for your naive zeal that caused the damage, but it was done out of sincerity, and so I had to make peace with that fragment, the part of myself that I know was just a kid doing what he was doing because he loved the God he believed in, and he loved the people he was serving, and he thought this was how you loved God and served people. And so I had to make peace with that image of myself. And it was like, for a long time, I lived as half of a person because I tried to hack off the first 25 years of my life and start here while neglecting all of that. And so I was like totally depleted because there was a whole part of my being that was not a part of my being anymore. Right. And so that was a fragment I had to gather. And I just had so many things like that. And then as a result of that, as a result of assimilating that into my being on 1 week, one weekend, I can do this show for people who are enthusiasts of the paranormal and all sorts of other things that would never go over on a Sunday morning, and speak at a relatively evangelical church 2 days later on a Sunday morning, which I just did recently, and it's like, it's really weird how this happens. And there has been a weird harmonizing of these things that don't make sense in my life. And so I guess this even kind of comes back to something I sent you in a message, is that last week I just straight up felt like prophesying on here, like old school, holding the microphone like this, prophesying days. You know what I'm talking about.
Oh yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Same back.
Maybe even the Stacey Campbell head shake. Those who have ears, let them hear. I think you're probably the only one who gets that reference, but I wanted to see. I just wanted to test you out. Yeah.
Oh man, I'll never forget at the Lakeland revival watching her. We had some mutual friends.
Yeah, we had her in once, and I drove her to the airport, and she did it in the car. And
I don't doubt it.
Yep,
I don't doubt it.
Sincere lady. Anyways, but I just straight up felt like I had a word almost, and it was based on the story of Jacob and Esau. And I really had a real sense in my life, I'm sure you do, if you know the works of G.I. Gurdjieff at all, Gurdjieff talked about life happening in 7-year cycles. And I had a very profound experience last week in which I realized I had come to the end of a 7-year cycle in my own life, kind of wandering. And I kind of felt to say that, and it happened on the night of the blue moon. I had a bunch of weird synchronicities happen where it was just really bizarre aligning of events, literal mirroring of events where people with the same name had the same thing happen, like in sequences, like bizarre. And I didn't even know that it was a blue moon, right? And so I'm up in bed, and the moon is streaming through, and I'm reading Alfred North Whitehead on chaos and novelty. And Andrea texts me, and she's like, enjoy the energy of the blue moon tonight, whatever. And I was like, oh, I didn't even realize. But I'm sitting there basking in it, and I'm feeling something. And as she says it, I just look it up, and it says, this won't occur again for another 14 years, which means we're at that's 2 sevens, which would mean you're at the end of 1 7-year cycle then. And so you're beginning another one. And I hit my Facebook memories, and it pops up that exactly 7 years ago that date, I launched I launched like a GoFundMe campaign, or like at the time that was kind of what you do instead of Patreon, because I was starting like a new ministry venture, post pastoring. Was about a year after stepping down, and I was starting something new. And I've done that kind of thing for about 7 years, and I've really been feeling I was at the end of it. And it was right that night I realized, oh my God, I'm at the end of this cycle, and something is beginning, something new is beginning. And I was taken to Jacob and Esau, and I was taken to Jacob and Esau had been estranged, right? They're twins, formed in the same womb, and they wrestled in that womb, right? Throughout the pregnancy, they wrestled in that womb. And when they're born, Esau is born first, and Jacob is born grabbing onto his heel. He's given the name Jacob, which is kind of a trickster figure, a heel grabber, a deceiver. And Jacob lives up to his reputation and his name his whole life. He eventually steals Esau's birthright. I know you say all that. I know you know all this, Aaron. I'm saying this for clarification.
Oh, yeah, of course. I'm loving it.
Yeah, and he cheats his brother out of his birthright, and the patriarchal figure in their life speaks the blessing of the firstborn over Jacob, who is the secondborn, and it can't be taken back. And so Jacob inherits double of what Esau would inherit. That's how it would have gone down. And so the two of them are estranged now, as you can imagine. And so Jacob hears that Esau much later on, he has his wives now. Again, it was a different time. He has his wives and his children. He's got his people there. And he hears that Jacob with a bunch of dudes is coming, or I'm sorry, Esau with a bunch of guys is coming to meet him. So we have the coming together of opposites, things that have been estranged from one another, things that no longer seem like they go together are coming together. And Jacob believes it's going to end in violence. That's the only thing he can imagine happening. And so he sends his people, he splits them up into two, and is like, well, if Esau finds you guys, he'll be too preoccupied to find you guys. So he sends them away, and he's at the ford of the Yabok, and he sends his wives and his children on. And then it says Jacob was left alone at night. And I know you know what that's like, Aaron. Everyone and everything that you once found your identity in and comfort in is gone, and you're left alone in the dark at the ford of the Yabok, and Esau is coming, and you feel this opposing force. These are fragments gathering together. And then it says, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just want to interject. It's interesting that Yabok, or Jabok, if you transliterate or whatever, and Jacob. It's fascinating. I just wanted to point that out.
It is. Yeah, no, very similar words. Yeah. But then it says a man wrestles with him till daybreak. Now, of course, that's what Jacob is expecting. Jacob is expecting Esau to find him and pounce on him. And so he's wrestling till daybreak. Of course, in his mind, this is his brother. We later find out it's a divine being. But what's interesting is that these two wrestled in the womb until they were born. And now, on the eve of something new being born, Jacob's wrestling again, right? Meaning he's in a womb right now. He's in the darkness of a womb.
So good.
And then the man says to him, hey, let me go, for it's daybreak. So the lesson is, when you find yourself at the end of a season, you have to let go of the thing you've been wrestling with, because you can't hold on to in the day what you were wrestling with in the night to prepare you for the day. You have to let go. But Jacob says, I won't let you go until you bless me. So the word there is, yes, let go, but don't let go until you learn from the season what you're meant to learn, or you'll repeat it. And you don't want to repeat the 7th grade, right? Pass it the first time.
Dude.
That's and then I won't let you go until you bless me. And then Jacob says, ultimately, as it goes on, he says, I won't let you go until you bless me. And then this figure blesses him by saying, you think you're Jacob, the trickster, the deceiver, the heel grabber, but I tell you, you're Israel. For you're a God fighter. You have wrestled with God and men and have prevailed. Israel can also mean a prince with God. So your nobility lays in the fact that you can wrestle with God and with men, and you can prevail. So Jacob is introduced to himself in this chaotic wrestling. He's being born again. He's wrestling. And he's being born again. And then he says, what's your name? And he's like, why do you ask me your name? and he smacks him on the hip and wrenches his hip, and he walks differently for the rest of his life. The point being, there is a belief, it's still a belief in some magical circles, that to know the name of a deity or of a spiritual energy is to sort of gain control over it in some way, or in some way to be able to move that power in a certain direction by knowing its name. And this being says, this encounter is not about you knowing my name. This encounter is not you being able to control the chaos that comes upon you prior to new birth. This is about you knowing your name, not you knowing my name. This is about you knowing who you are, knowing that you can wrestle through the night and prevail and be born again on the other side. It's not about you knowing that you can control things. You need to let the uncontrollable remain uncontrollable, because the uncontrollable is what causes you to be born again. Anyways,
dude, the reason I brought up the name of the river, because I knew where you were going with this, I think. And that was just amazing. I mean, that actually, Jeff, I have to tell you, and I won't share all of it on air, but later, that really speaks to me, because I know I'm coming to the end of a 7-year cycle. I know that for a fact. And my birthday was the night of the blue supermoon.
See?
And
yeah, man,
that just spoke to me on so many levels. But the reason I brought up the name of the river is because it's the same letters in the Hebrew, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but it's crooked. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not Jacob. Again, I'm transliterating it to English. It's not Jacob, it's Jabok. Mm-hmm. And water in scripture, I know you know this, in the Hebrew scripture, when you do the gematria and you look at the Hebrew letters, has a lot to do with consciousness, right? Out of your innermost being will flow rivers of living water. Counsel in the heart of man is like deep waters, and a man of understanding brings it out, right? And so it's just amazing. That's why I can never totally divorce myself from scripture, because when you can look at it symbolically and metaphorically and mythologically, speaking to your spiritual potentials, right? So here Jacob is, he's wrestling with a divine being. Some commentaries say it was, the spirit of Esau, or and he's going to meet his brother Esau, who also represents, Jacob and Esau can represent masculine and feminine polarities, because Esau was hairy and Esau was out hunting, and Jacob was kind of a mama's boy. He stayed around mom, and mom that talked him into deceiving. We call him a liar, but really, if we get to heaven and find him, we're going to have to apologize, because really it was his mom that was putting the idea.
Right.
His problem was he was just mama's boy, right? So you see the masculine, feminine polarities, but I really do think it's significant that the river is named Jabok, because his identity is kind of crooked. He's kind of crooked within himself, right?
Yeah.
And so this wrestling, he's also wrestling with himself. Yeah. Wrestling with his own identity. And then he gets a new name. I just love what you did with that, Jeff. He gets a new name, but he has to let go of the former season. And I was thinking about this earlier when you were talking, and I don't have time to get into it, but, talking about John's writings, one perspective, and I'm not saying it's the right perspective, but that's the great thing about conversation, right? One perspective, when you look at the book of Revelation very symbolically, at the end of the book, you have the harlot of Babylon, right? Riding on a beast. And it says in there, he that has understanding, let him calculate the number of the name. And then, we get into all this weird stuff from Christianity with 666, all that stuff, right? But then the next thing, it says, John's invited to a higher perspective. Come up higher, and I will show you the bride, the Lamb's wife. And what's interesting about the harlot is that it says that the harlot had received the seed of all the nations of the world, right? So this is the way I look at this. We come to points in our life, and I know this is true for me. I often tell people, if my past self could have seen my future self and what I believe now and what I'm doing now and what I'm saying now, I would have killed myself, because I genuinely would have believed. And I'm not, it's not because I would be suicidal, but my former self would have genuinely believed that I completely backslid and lost my salvation and was going to hell.
Oh, yeah. Yep. No, I get it. Yeah.
And so from that perspective, from the perspective of my past self, I look at myself now and I say I'm a beast. I say I'm a harlot.
Mm.
But if you calculate the number of the name and you take a higher perspective, you find out this fits perfectly with what you were saying.
Mm.
So you give out the bread, and the bread comes back, in the 7 baskets, the Canaanite nations. So I think we go through phases where we look at something and we vilify it and we call it evil.
Mm.
And then usually it's when we've perfected something. And so when Paul is writing in Philippians chapter 3, he says, I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews. I was born of the tribe of Benjamin. I'm a Pharisee. And he says this. He says,
Yeah.
as to keeping the law, I was perfect.
Yeah. Yep.
And then he says, but then I counted all of that as dung,
Yep.
that I might gain Christ, right? So there was a perfecting of this. There was a calculating the number of the name, if you will, and then saying, okay, now it's time to let go of what was. It's to let go of that form and that fashion. Like, we've perfected that form. We've perfected that state.
Yeah.
And I think it's safe to say, and I'm using this loosely for all the perfectionists out there, but I think it's safe to say, knowing, like you sharing your background and the things that you experienced, we had perfected ministry. We had perfected that charismatic aspect of ourselves, right? And so then comes this point in time where it's like, okay, now there's this deconstruction, there's this chaos, there's this nighttime, there's this going into the womb, there's this going into darkness, right? And so now I find myself in a place where my former me would call me a beast, my former me would call me darkness.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet I'm seeing it from a totally different perspective. So what I'm trying to say is, like, I think the harlot and the bride in the book of Revelation are the same thing, seen from 2 different perspectives.
Yeah.
One's seen from the earthly perspective and the religious mindset, and the other seen from a more heavenly perspective that sees the unity and the gathering of the fragments and everything that you've been saying. So I hope that makes sense. But
oh no, man, absolutely.
It's shared that Jacob stuff. That was just so powerful for me personally and just profound.
It's been rocking my world this last couple of weeks. And just the fact that the 7s even align with you, and even I never even thought about it, but even the gathering of the fragments, it was 7 baskets. Just the significance of the 7 there didn't even dawn on me until we were talking about it just now. But I'm going to say that again then, and I'm going to say it again so I hear it and everyone hears it. This is not this. It's too specific to be for everyone. But I do believe that there are many of you listening to this broadcast tonight, other than myself and Aaron, who are also at the end of a 7-year cycle of some kind. And if you go back in your history and look, you will find it. You will see, oh, I get it. It might not be as exact as like the serendipities and synchronicities that pile on top of one another where you're like, oh, literally 7 years. It might not be as exact as all that. There might be some change on that 7, but you will find it to be the truth. And if you feel right now a sort of chaos within you, because I did, that day when that happened, man, it was one of the most chaotic days I had had in a very long time. And something happened to me that rattled me to the point where things that I was so sure and certain of, that I was just like the foundation under my feet, just in a certain area of life, it just turned to sand and then some, and was just gone. And I felt so out of sorts, so much chaos. And I lay down on my bed prior to the realization that I had later on in talking with Andrea. And I lay down on my bed, I put on some white noise and closed my eyes just to do some meditating. And I was like, I need peace, and I need to know what's happening. And I just heard it come forth like, this chaos that you are feeling is creating complexity, and that complexity is the raw material that will give rise to novelty in the next season of your life. And I knew immediately, and I'd been meditating on this idea. I'd been meditating on that idea prior to that happening. So that wasn't like a total surprise, but even though that thought had occurred to me before, it liberated me in that moment. And, I used the illustration before. Chaos is actually a good thing. And what Jacob experienced in that night when he was left alone was chaos. An unknown figure jumping you and wrestling with you is chaos.
Yeah.
And the thing about the man who said, let me go, let me go because the season is changing. When Jacob let go and stopped wrestling, what ends up happening later in the story is he reunites with Esau, and it's a beautiful reunion, and there is no wrath or violence that occurs. So the letting go is not let go so, Esau can take off and you never have to like reconcile. The letting go is stop wrestling so that the reconciliation can happen. And it's like if you're moving a sparkler around in the dead of night, it has that drag and that tail behind it. Okay. But when you stop spinning it, all of it just collapses into that one burning tip at the end. Right. And so it's like everything, this illusion of there being this tail just. So stop wrestling so you can come into oneness and wholeness kind of thing. But the chaos, it's like the chaos that you experience, it always precedes birth of some kind, right? We talked about this last time you were on. Chaos precedes creation, the tohu, vabohu, or however, I believe. It wasn't really creation ex nihilo in Genesis 1. It was actually creation from chaos.
Right.
And chaos is like, if you think of the monkey typewriter theorem, right? You put enough monkeys in a room and you give them enough typewriters and you give them enough time, eventually they'll reproduce the works of William Shakespeare. So the theory goes. But let's say you reduce the number of monkeys to one, you deconstruct the typewriter, scatter it all over the room, you put a ream of paper in the corner and you give it 5 minutes. Well, you're not going to get much out of that.
Right.
Okay. You increase the chaos by increasing the number of monkeys and the typewriters and the complexity of the situation. It creates more chaos, but it creates more complexity, and therefore novelty is more likely to arise from it. You give the monkeys laptops with predictive text and AI technology on it, and you increase the time limit. Well, now you've actually shortened the time frame in which they are likely to produce the novel. So the more chaos, the more complexity, the more likely it is for novelty to occur. So sometimes it's those moments when we feel more at peace that we're actually in danger of stagnating. So sometimes chaos is a gift, right? And it came upon me that day as a gift because I knew I was on the brink of change and I had to make some changes in a lot of different areas, just life, employment, all those kinds of things. I knew there were some big shifts that had to be made. I knew it. And I know they're not shifts that are going to happen tomorrow, but the process had to start. And some things had to force me to make that decision. Otherwise, I would not have. That very day, there is a tire I had in my car that was about as bald as my grandpa was at 75, and it needed to be changed. And I was just like, I only drive this thing 5 minutes to work back and forth. I don't need to get it changed. Well, on the way home, I got a flat and I had to get it changed. And that was one of the things that spoke to me. It's like, there's things in your life you've been tolerating for too long. I'm just going to let go. They're going to go bad. Chaos is going to end of your life, and you're going to be forced to fix it. Like, that's sometimes the purpose of it. You now have to do something about it. What are you going to do otherwise? And anyways, so that's that whole thing for me and what that represents. And some of you listening, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and you're exactly in that space and in that place. And I just want to give you hope that the chaos is giving the universe, God, whatever word you prefer, the raw materials it needs. It's giving you the raw materials you need to create the future that you're actually desiring, as opposed to the present that you loathe, right? And the thing you feel stuck in. So don't curse it and stop fighting it. Let it go so you can stop fighting with it so you can start dancing with it. Anyways.
Dude, you talked about the electricity of God in conversation from Martin Buber, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, earlier, and this is I'm experiencing this, so I just want to share with the audience. If you remember the first time I was on, I shared about my deconstruction experience, and for a lot of people in the deconstruction community, who have deconstructed their beliefs around their faith and that kind of stuff, it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. And yeah, it was a process for sure. But 7 years ago, August 13th, 7 years ago, I laid down on my bed because a lot of past traumas had come up, and I was just trying to, so I'm meditating, and I have this encounter with spirit guides. I mean, there was nothing Christian about it. They weren't, it wasn't Jesus. It wasn't Mary or Michael, the archangel. It was, you know, and I saw the sheer futility in a moment of time. 15 minutes totally changed my life. But I had this experience, and I shared it, I think, on that original broadcast, and that was 7 years ago in August, right?
Mm.
Yeah. And I saw the complete futility of my life. The way I would describe it to people is like I had spent 25 years of my life climbing a ladder only to get to the top of the ladder and realize it was leaning against the wrong building. Mm. That's how it felt coming out of that experience. But here's the interesting thing, and I never share this, Jeff. I don't know that this is probably the first time I've ever shared it publicly. Mm. But at the end of that experience, because I realized that my whole life was about to blow up.
Yeah.
Because I couldn't, so the ladder's leaning against the wrong building, you know, and I couldn't do make believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I couldn't fake it, you know, and that's why awakening is not something necessarily that's so wonderful and great, because I came out of that experience and every dysfunctional pattern in my ministry, every dysfunctional pattern in my life, my relationships, myself was staring me in the face every time I turned around. And I thought I was losing my mind. Mm. You know, I went to therapy and all kinds of stuff to deal with that. But at the end of that experience, I don't remember exactly. I'd have to go back to my journal to read exactly how I heard it. But whatever was speaking to me in that experience said, we've tried, you need to see this through. You need to stick it out. You need to stay on the altar until it's all burned up, basically.
Yeah.
Don't save the best portions. You need to kill all the sheep of who was the Amalekites or whatever, right? And this is what they said, because we've tried every 7 years in your life to initiate this process. And if you don't stick with this, it will start over again in 7 years.
Wow.
I was able to look back at significant shifts that had happened at the time I was 45. I was able to look back at significant shifts at 38, at 30, 31, at 23, and so on. And I realized I was on this 7-year cycle thing, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm coming up, you know, August was the anniversary of that. It's also the day of my birthday. So August 30th, when they had the super blue moon, that was my birthday. And I have experienced on many levels complete chaos the last month. And I've just been like, what the hell is going on here?
Yeah.
And so what you shared, I just wanted to share that with you and with the audience. Like, you're not just pulling stuff out of the air. This is that electricity of God for me that we were talking about, because I knew I was coming up on the end of that 7-year cycle.
Yeah.
I can see out of what you said that there are things that I still need to let go of. There are things within me that I still need to resolve. There are hurts and Esau's.
Yeah.
In my life that I'm still reconciling. And so, man, that just beautifully spoke to me. So I just wanted to share that in real time with you and the audience.
That's awesome. That's incredible, because we didn't discuss anything about sevens or 7 cycles. That's just purely, it's in the air apparently, because that's amazing. And that, I mean, obviously that even comes back to me in the sense of like, it encourages me in where I'm at, that I'm not just making this up, you know, because boy, the chaos was real, and it's easy to like want to reach for meaning in the midst of chaos, which is why conspiracy theories exist, because in the midst of chaos, we want to make it make sense. So, well, the government blew that up, or the government did that, or the government, there are some conspiracies that are real, of course. I mean, I'm not saying any of the ones I just said were, but I mean, anytime anything happens that makes us feel out of control, conspiracy theories can be a comfort, because chaos is terrifying. So it is sometimes, you know, am I just making this up? Are these coincidences I'm seeing and these synchronicities I'm perceiving? Is this just my mind trying to like create patterns to bring me a sense of peace and ease? And then, you know, by the mouth of 2 or 3 others, it's confirmed. And once I have it confirmed like that, I have my heading, and I know what I have to do. And you're one of those confirmations to me tonight as well. So even the thing that I was already pretty certain of, hearing it come from your mouth that it resonates with you, and it's the same journey you're on, that's confirmation for me again too. So that's amazing. And I guess one of the things I wanted to say is that coming together of Jacob and Esau, that coming together for me, part of that gathering of fragments from my past that we're talking about, it is that reconciliation of brothers who were estranged. You know, the past part of me, the more fundamentalist part of me, and the present version of me, who is a very different individual, you know, but those two things meeting. And that wrestling, you know what, I had never really thought of that until a couple of weeks ago when I was meditating on this passage about how they were wrestling in the womb, and how the wrestling at the wrestling prior to his meeting of Esau, it in some way represents that he's in a womb and about to be born again as something new, and that new birth is him reconciling with Esau and these things coming together. And this is what the alchemists would have called the coincidentia oppositorum, which means the coincidence or the coincidence of opposites, things that don't, well, as you said, mythologically speaking, maybe the principle of masculine and feminine, that our ancient forebears saw, that when these two things that seem opposite come together, new life comes forth from it. And so thus developed a sort of quasi-magical principle, even that this is the way the universe functions, that things that are opposite come together and new life comes forth. And so Jacob and Esau come together, and a whole new reality kind of comes forth. There's a new birth that happens. And I'm seeing that in my own life right now too, that it's time to take the fragments of past Jeff, who Jeff was there, even Jeff as the preacher, an identity that in some ways I tried to get away from, you know, to realize, and this is something I realized even just like the last couple of weeks. It's like, oh yeah, because before Jacob's wrestling buddy calls him Israel, he makes him tell him his name.
Yeah.
He says, what's your name? Jacob. So the wrestling will make you come to terms with who you were. You have to say your name that you've identified with before the new name is given you, right?
And here's the cool thing about that. I really believe that if you look at the culture of the day and a cultural understanding, the firstborn, even in the law, the firstborn, the one that opens the womb, that's the key.
Yeah. Yeah.
That one belongs to the Lord, right? So that one got the double portion. And so Jacob and Esau are wrestling in the womb for the birthright, the firstborn birthright. But regardless, Esau comes out first. Esau is the one that opens the womb, essentially.
Right.
Jacob comes out second. So again, like you said, it's bringing this all together when Jesus was feeding the 5,000 plus women and children. Women and children did not have the same status.
Right.
And so the fact that Isaac rejects Esau, even though there was a word at the beginning that the elder would serve the younger and all of that.
Yeah.
Isaac rejects Jacob and favors Esau. So I want you to think about the fact that Jacob has to dress up as Esau in order to get his father's blessing. And so the story is really being told from the perspective of the outsider.
You're about to preach, Aaron. I feel it coming.
We read this story like it's being told from the perspective of the righteous person. But it's really being told from the perspective of the reject. It's really being told from the perspective of the shadow, if you will, if you want to use Jungian language, right? And he has to wear a mask. He has to wear the social persona of his brother Esau in order to receive his father's blessing.
Yeah.
Anytime we do that, Jeff, and this was my problem in ministry, man, I spent so much time being Esau. I spent so much time letting Mother Church, if you will, tell me how to dress and how to approach the Father.
Yeah.
I have to be in Christ. I have to be under the blood. I have to be, all these things. And so there's deep self-rejection in all of that.
Oh yeah.
God can't relate to me. God can only relate to me if I'm under the blood, as we used to say, or if I'm in Christ. So Isaac is relating to, he's not really blessing Jacob. The blessing is transferred to Jacob, but he has to come disguised as Esau. So Jacob has this issue of identity, and he has this issue of blessing his entire life when he has the dream of the ladder that's set up, and God tells him, the Lord stands above the ladder, and he says, I'm with you. I'm with you. You're the habitation.
Mm-hmm.
And Jacob wakes up, and what does he do? He anoints the place.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The place wasn't special. Jacob was special.
Right,
the place wasn't where the ladder was. Jacob was where the ladder was. And it's in the text.
Map is not the territory, right?
Yeah, I'll go with you everywhere you go.
Yeah.
So he didn't have to go back to Bethel. But he can't connect with these blessings because he can't connect with these distorted images, these fragments, if you will, of himself, these past parts of himself that have been rejected. And so now he's on his way to meet Esau, and he thinks Esau is going to probably want to kill him and exact his vengeance and all this stuff. And again, he's wrestling, right? He's wrestling. And what is your name? He has to own that. I love how you said that. He has to own what his name is. I won't let you go until you bless me. What is your name? So he sets himself up for the first time in his life for the most outsider parts of him, the most rejected parts of him, the most wounded parts of him, the most to own that and say, I'm Jacob. Here I am with all my warts, with all my mess, with all my stuff, with all my regrets, with all my rejection and all my trauma and all my pain. Jacob. Because before he was blessed as Esau.
Yeah.
So he has to sort all of that out before he can meet his brother and have the inner and the outer. So the inner reconciliation had to come first, the letting go, like you said, the embracing of chaos, the allowing for novelty to emerge. Goes back to what we talked about in the beginning. If I'm sitting here running my Google pages of doom, or I'm regretting my past, then I'm trying to figure everything out, right? And I'm trying to control the chaos. I'm trying to all that stuff. And so the power of just being able to embrace the Jacob that's us.
Yeah.
And understand that Jacob I have loved.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Aaron, that was so good, man. Because yes, I used to call it Esau costume theology. That even the evangelical doctrine of atonement is that God could only. This is an absolutely terrible illustration, but it was this sort of fraternity joke where guys would say certain people looked more attractive when they saw them through beer goggles.
Right.
And I used to say and we have this sort of frat boy God who only finds you attractive when he sees you through blood goggles, which was when he sees you through the blood of Jesus, then all of a sudden he finds you, oh, you're beautiful because you look like my son. And that's the way that we would understand, the Father accepting us is because we're in Christ. So he's like, it sounds like Jeff, but it looks like Jesus. So I accept you. And he kind of smuggles you in under the radar. But that, I love how you spun that, though, that Jacob he only ever knew what it was like to be blessed as someone else. But here on this night, this man says, let me go for its daybreak. Jacob says, I won't let you go till you bless me. And then his wrestling partner says, okay, what is your name? Jacob. He says, no longer shall you be called Jacob, but Israel. So for the first time, he's blessed for exactly who he is. When he owns who he is, the blessing comes. That was so beautifully stated.
It comes at twilight. It comes at the time when darkness and light are combined.
Yes. Yeah. Which is what the whole story is about.
Right.
The coming together of opposites, the coincidence of opposites, and that what comes forth from it is something that's never been seen before. And so for me, that's been about owning my history and the part of me, again, that I rejected, which was Preacher Jeff, because I know who Preacher Jeff was. not just when he was on stage, but when he was off stage. But I also know that Preacher Jeff is, in a sense, who I was. And I know for you as well, when you are that person, there is a gift you have that you can't deny. And
Yeah.
we can feign humility about it. But you know when you're gifted in a certain area, and you
Right.
know when you're functioning outside of that gifting, how sometimes miserable it can be. And
Yeah.
so part of it, even for me, is to like own that part of yourself, but own it in the context of who you are now. So who are you? Hi, yeah, I'm Jeff. I'm Jeff, the ex-preacher. I'm Jeff, the ex-pastor. And it's like, okay, that's what you've been called before, but this is who you are now. And it includes who you were before. Because who you were before is the reason you're receiving this now, because now that you're owning it, right? And anyways, it's that owning of the history, it's that owning of the fragments of our past that we'd rather reject, that will give birth to the new, that will allow us to be released from whatever cycle it is that we've been in, be it a 7-year cycle, be it a 20-year cycle, be it whatever. For us, it just so happens to be a coincidence that it was a 7. And I don't know. What a beautiful conversation this has been, Aaron. And
Yeah.
we only got a few minutes left. Believe it or not, we did get kind of caught up in that eternal swirl tonight in
We
time
did.
to fly.
We did.
But at the same time, I feel like this conversation has been so dense. If I dropped it on the floor, it would go down to the 7th level of hell or something. That's how. And some would say that's exactly where it belongs. But,
Yeah, exactly.
but just before we wrap up tonight, man, is there anything else you wanna say? I think we got about 2 minutes left.
Well, I hope that the people listening and watching have benefited from this. But I just want to thank you, Jeff. Like, you really, I needed to hear what you had to say tonight. And I just happened to be a guest. But I'm so appreciative of the wisdom that you share. And again, for allowing me to come and be your guest. Deeply honored. And I just want to say thank you.
Well, man, and I appreciate you being here. And I received as much from the conversation as I think anyone else did. And so everyone watching tonight, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for listening to us just talk about stuff. And I know it's landed for some of you as well. And, it's my hope and prayer for you that you have an amazing week. And we will see you back here next week. Same time, Andrea will be back. Aaron, thanks again for being here, my brother. I love you. You've become one of my favorite people on this planet. And I really appreciate your gift. Ladies and gentlemen, until next week, class is dismissed. Peace.